We as Catholics refer to the popes as Holy Father. They're fathers because they oversee and govern the church, and we call them holy because they're set apart. Now, unfortunately, from the time of the 1500s, from Saint Pius V, he's the Pope of Lepanto, as we saw in the NSTI video in Lepanto, all the way to the 1900s, there were no saint popes. Even before that, in the Middle Ages, as we saw, there were popes who were not living their vows of celibacy, who were doing all kinds of sketchy things financially. And it's really this shift that we saw in the last video with Pius IX, where the church is stripped of the papal states, the Pope is stripped of his temporal power, and so the popes have to really bury themselves into what it means to be the Pope on a spiritual level. And when that happens with Pius IX and then into the 1900s, we suddenly have the popping up of sainted popes. So far, 3 popes in the 1900s. So in this lesson, we're going to run through the popes of the 1900s. We're going to go from the pope who was after Pius IX from the previous lesson all the way up to John Paul II. We'll actually do a whole lesson on John Paul II in the future. But for now, the popes of the 1900s, let's get started with the first one, Pope Leo XIII. Leo XIII was the 256th pope. He reigned from 1878 to 1903, about 25 years. And he is the oldest pope of all time. He died at age 93. In fact, when Saint Therese of Lisieux, the little flower, met Leo XIII, she remarked on how old he looked, that he was so old that he looked like he was dead. So she saw him towards the end of his pontificate in his approaching of 93 years of age. He is Italian. He was born with the name Gioacchino Vincenzo Raffaele Luigi Pecci. Hopefully I got that correct. And he's remembered for a few things. First of all, his encyclical Rerum Novarum. And this encyclical condemned socialism, communism, and unrestricted capitalism. So an important economic contribution from the papacy. He also, important for us at the New St. Thomas Institute, wrote the encyclical Aeterni Patris. And this is the encyclical we've talked about so many times in NSTI that made Thomas Aquinas the normative theologian for the Catholic Church. Leo XIII basically says, hey, if you're going to be teaching in the seminary, university, you're going to be teaching anything Catholic, Thomas Aquinas is the anchor. We need to build on Aquinas and Thomism. And then also he's known as the Pope of the Rosary. He issued, get this, 11 encyclicals on the topic of the Rosary. He wanted Catholics to pray the Rosary. It's one of the reasons why in the New St. Thomas Institute we encourage daily Rosary. It's a Dominican devotion. It goes back to St. Dominic, and it roots us in the Gospels, roots us in the life of Christ, and it roots us in the prayers of Our Lady. I personally love Leo XIII. I think he should be declared a Catholic saint because he's the Pope of the Rosary. He loves Thomas Aquinas. Also, for me personally, he's the Pope who declared Anglican orders invalid. I used to be an Anglican or Episcopalian priest before becoming Catholic, and it was his encyclical on that topic, Apostolicae Curae, which helped convince me to leave the Episcopal Church and become a Catholic. So I have a devotion to him. Every time I'm in Rome, I go to St. John Lateran and pray at his tomb. The next Pope is Saint Pius X, our first sainted Pope of the 1900s. He was Pope from 1903 to 1914, 11 years. His birth name is Giuseppe Melchiorre Sarto. Of course, he's Italian. His motto is Instaurare omnia in Christo, restore all things in Christ. Now, he's remembered for not only being a saint, but he encouraged and expanded weekly reception of the Eucharist and frequent confession. He also notably lowered the age for First Communion for children from the age of 12 to the age of 7, the age of reason. He also issued the oath against modernism. Pius X realized the greatest heresy of his time was that of modernism, that is, compromising the Catholic faith, our doctrines, and our morals to be conformed with modern rationalistic approaches to philosophy, to theology, to government, to economics, to everything. And so he created an oath that all clergy and all professors and teachers of Catholic theology had to recite, an oath against modernism. He caught a lot of flack for that. Personally, I think it was a great idea. Liturgically, he advocated Gregorian chant, 2 thumbs up, and he reformed the Roman breviary. He initiated the reform of canon law, beginning the new Code of Canon Law, which will be finished by his successor. He also issued a catechism known as the Catechism of St. Pius X. This is a great resource, and I would encourage you to get a copy of it and to read through his Catechism of Catholic Theology, the Catechism of Pius X. Moving along, we look at his successor, Benedict XV. Now, Benedict XV was the 258th Pope. He was from 1914 from 1922, 7 years. His birth name was Giacomo Polo Giovanni Battista della Chiesa, and he was Italian. His motto was In te Domine speravi, non confundor in aeternum. In thee, O Lord, have I trusted, let me not be confounded in eternity. He's remembered for being the Pope of World War I. He himself identified World War I as the, quote, suicide of Europe. This was Europe trying to kill itself. And of course, it would lead to a lack of faith in the years to come. He was the Pope during the Fatima apparitions in 1917, and he also issued the new Code of Canon Law that Pius X had begun, known as the Pio Benedictine Code of Canon Law, 1917. And he expanded global missionary work through his document Maximum Illud. So he's known for World War I, for his missionary work, and for the new Code of Canon Law. His successor is Pius XI. Pius XI was Pope from 1922 to 1939, 17 years. His birth name was Achille Ambrogio Damiano Ratti. He's Italian. His motto was Pax Christi in Regno Christi, the peace of Christ in the kingdom of Christ. And he's remembered for signing the Lateran Treaty with Italy in 1929. We mentioned that in our lesson on Vatican I. This made the Vatican City its own city-state, its own nation. He also founded Vatican Radio in 1931. He refounded the Pontifical Academy of the Sciences in 1936. He created the Feast of Christ the King to stress that Christ is the King of all nations. This was in response to the secularization of politics during this time period. And he spoke against communism and against the emerging Nazism in Germany, a prophet in that way. His successor is Pius XII, who is the Pope, really, of World War II. He was Pope from 1939 to 1958. That's 19 years. He was born Eugenio Maria Giuseppe Giovanni Pacelli. He's Italian. His motto was Opus Justitiae Pax. The work of justice is peace. He reduced the Italian cardinals to less than 50% of the College of Cardinals. And he's the first Pope to explicitly invoke papal infallibility in defining the Assumption of Mary as dogma. He also wrote the encyclical Humani Generis, which issued caution about Nouvelle Théologie. We'll talk about that when we get to Vatican II. And also caution about human evolution. And he upheld the idea of monogenism. That is, all people come from one couple who we identify as Adam and Eve. He openly condemned communism and Nazism. However, many people fault him for not condemning Nazism enough. However, he did seek to perform a distance exorcism on Adolf Hitler, it is said. And people are often divided over Pius XII, whether he was strong enough during World War II. We'll leave that to the historians. I personally think he did a pretty good job on that. He was succeeded by St. John the 23rd. He was Pope from 1958 to 1963, only 4 years. He was born Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli. He's Italian, and his motto was Obedientia in Pax, obedience in peace. John the 23rd was known as the Good Pope, and he opened the Second Vatican Council in 1962. We'll dedicate a whole NSTI lesson to the Second Vatican Council. He wrote the encyclical Pacem in Terris in 1963. That was on peace and encouraging nuclear disarmament. He also intervened for peace during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was in 1962. He also increased the number of cardinals to the number 90. Previously, it had been set at 70 as the limit, Why? Because Moses had 70 counselors in the Old Testament. See Numbers 11 for that. He was succeeded by Paul VI. Paul VI was pope from 1963 to 1978, 15 years. He was born Giovanni Battista Enrico Antonio Maria Montini, and his motto was Cum ipso in monte, with him on the mount, kind of a play on his name because his last name was Montini. He was Italian, of course, and he's remembered to be the last pope crowned with the papal tiara. He's also the first pope since 1809 to travel outside of Italy. He went even as far as the United States and Australia. He closed the Second Vatican Council. He issued the super controversial encyclical Humanae Vitae in 1968, condemning artificial contraception. He also promulgated the Novus Ordo Missae, the new order of the Mass, a vernacular Mass, in 1970, which had a new liturgy, a revised calendar, and the languages of the people. He promoted ecumenism and dialogue with world religions. He increased the size of the College of Cardinals to 145. Previously, it had been set at 70. And another controversial thing, he restricted the right to vote in papal conclaves to those under the age of 80, thereby pretty much making all the previous generation cardinals no longer able to vote. Kind of a revolutionary move right there. And he set the maximum of voting cardinals at 120. That's Paul VI. Paul VI was succeeded by Pope John Paul I, and he was pope for only 33 days, from 26th of August, 1978 to the 28th of September. His birth name was Albino Luciani. His motto was simply humilitas, humility. He's Italian. He's remembered for abolishing the papal coronation with the papal tiara in favor of papal inauguration. So a symbolic change. He also prophetically referred to himself as John Paul I, which is not usually the custom of a pope who's the first of that name, which seems to assume that there'd be another pope that would follow him, being John Paul II. And we'll stop there because the next pope indeed is Saint John Paul II. And we'll continue with him in the next New St. Thomas Institute lesson. Till then, God bless.